Welcome to the panel. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Yunfei Zhao, and I'm a correspondent with CGTN China Global Television Network. Today's theme is meeting the world's food security challenges. Now, the Asia Pacific has entered a stage of post-pandemic recovery, but in addition, the impact brought by the pandemic has not yet over. If you're talking about the ramping virus, in addition to that, there are inflationary pressure, conflicts, and those are all some of the impacts brought by that can impact on the food security. But it's not only about the food chains, but also about there's more than just supply, and there's overconsumption and large emissions, and those are exaggerated the demand of food as well. So today we're going to cover multiple perspectives. We're going to talk about what happened to our food security and how technologies are applied to tackle those challenges, as well as what are the business solutions. So we have three distinguished guests, and I would say we have a very good mix of guests. We have an activist as well, an advisor, we have an entrepreneur, we have also a leader, a startup leader. So great to have you, gentlemen. I want to start from you, Paul. So you are an advisor to many of the investors and companies. So you have been analyzing, putting insights on, challenges and opportunities to food. And according to the environment so far, I wanted to start it off by saying what is happening at this moment. What are the challenges to sustainability?
Yeah, thank you, and I think it's great to be here. Let me start really with the big picture, and that is that we have a food system globally which is inherently unsustainable. I don't just mean it's bad environmentally. I mean it's unsustainable as in it can't continue as it is with the growth rate that we've got. And there's a lot of reasons for that, a lot of pressures behind that of different types, and I won't go through all of them, but I will say that climate change is probably the single biggest problem. And the reason it's a big problem for us is because it affects the entire food system, but in many ways we don't yet understand. Because the climate is changing so quickly and in ways that we weren't expecting in terms of speed, the impact of that on terms of the stability of the global food system is very hard to predict. Now, what we've learned in recent times with COVID, with the war in Ukraine and so on, is that the system is what I would call tightly wound. It's very tight, right? And that means it doesn't take a lot to interrupt it. And that's important because climate change is going to have unpredictable impacts across many different areas. But the second thing about that is that the food system, especially livestock, is a big driver of climate change. So the food system is both a victim of climate and a cause of climate change. And that makes it particularly hard, I think, to think about how the system is going to change.
Exactly. So climate change it's in a perspective that lasts for so long, but in addition to that, Prasit, you mentioned a lot about the COVID-19 pandemic. There's so much impact on that. And also your company, CP Group, have been involved in many administrative decisions to Thailand as well. Your CEO has been a board member on COVID-19 and many sustainable development. So what's your analysis on the situation in Thailand and in general in the world?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me today. The situation in Thailand, it may be a bit different from other places. Thailand is the main export country for food. And if I can remember number correctly, I think we have more than 10,000 production food company in the country. And each year, the Thailand export close to, I think last year maybe close to 35 billion US for export food into other country. So Thailand would have less problem in big picture comparing to other country in general. However, during the pandemic, it's also hurting us at certain level. For example, in my company, we have a lot of people working for us. During the pandemic, the government have a serious measurement not to allow, and to protect people in general from the COVID. In our company, we have what we call the food system, not to, if anyone checking every day, we call bubble and zoning our operation. So what happened for us, I think for every company also in Thailand, is that the capacity have been reducing significantly because of not enough labor. But I think pandemic also teaching us so many things, and I believe that the food system, food security during the pandemic and now, people are many countries, not just Thailand also. I actually operate in many countries. Lastly, we have 17 countries that we are operating to, and we also export to about 40 countries. So for example, during the pandemic, like Singapore, also not have enough food, don't have enough chicken, don't have enough egg to consume. So Singapore also start thinking about the food security level that they have. Would they have enough? How much they can rely on other country? Mostly they import from Malaysia in terms of the chicken, in terms of egg, and that's what the relationship that they have. So I think even the Singapore government need to rethink about should they produce food in their own country, but the issue would be it's quite small. Normally they would like to use their area and the place that they have for the innovation product, not just the product in general on the community level. We also talking with many other countries. Actually, if I don't know whether should I mention about that, but there are other leaders. Also the president in many other countries also start thinking about the level of food sufficiency that the country itself can produce. What should be the level on that one? That also I think it will make a new change. All thing of this is happen because of pandemic, and people become fear at the key factor of not having enough. And of course, with some other, climate change that you mentioned, I think the climate change would be the maybe not medium term, even now, but it will be more serious if we not act enough, not doing fast enough on the climate change, and then maybe we talk a little bit more on the sustainability and climate change later on. Thank you.
Yeah, so we talk about the the supply chain issue, and then John, you are bringing in the solution from a different perspective, which is to bring in food in a more sustainable way or a more efficient way. How does Evolve Meat, tackling the crisis, or what problem do you guys want to resolve?
Perfect. Thank you very much, and thank you for the panel that's here to have me. So we're a cultivated meat company out of Canada. What that means is we try to recreate whole cuts of meat directly from stem cells without having to regrow the animal. In addition to that, we're able to, uniquely from our end, actually create avatars of different tissues that would be present in the animal body to sustainably grow those tissues without anything exogenous. So to the point that Prasit made, with a lot of countries, you really have to start the discussion with whether or not they're net importers or net exporters of meat. And Singapore is a perfect example where you have nearly 100% net importing, if not 100%. So by providing technologies that can scale up and don't require the amount of land that industrial livestock farming would require, doesn't set off the same amount of carbon emission, you create a very sustainable system that can grow forward, that removes variability directly out of the food system. And with food security, obviously we always think about access to food as that definition, but it's really the removal of variability from each step in that process that's going to be the key. And we think that's going to be the great enabler moving forward.
Yeah, so I want to further expand the question on what are the impacts so far. So I want to ask about Ukraine. I'm really curious about that, Paul. I was in Ukraine in the first half of this year. When I was at the Black Sea, I mean, it's safely guarded. The Ukrainian side is really worried about any kind of revenge. So after they taking control of the Black Sea and the port of Odessa, so it's a very important port over there in Ukraine. So how does the overall Ukraine crisis impact the food chain, the food supply?
Yeah, I think it's a really important example, not just because of the direct impacts in this particular case, but what it shows us about the broader system. Now, we are dependent upon a very carefully managed, just-in-time supply chain for food, right? And what that means is, yes, this time it's Ukraine, but next time it might be a really bad drought somewhere, or a really bad flood somewhere critical, or it might be another conflict that prevents export from a certain area. And we have designed the system as though free trade is always going to occur and there's always peace in the world, which of course, if you look back very far, you see that's not a normal situation, right? Now, that really doesn't matter if it's televisions or your car or you can't get your washing machine fixed, it's a little bit annoying, right? If you can't get food, it's a little bit more than annoying, right? And it's why this issue is so important to me, is if we don't manage our food system globally in a very careful way, the flow-on effects into further conflict, into refugee flows, into, in this particular example, if control of food becomes a weapon, right? If I can control a supply chain or a port or an area, right, as a way of punishing another country, that gets into a very, very dangerous spiral. And that's why I find John's technology kind of solution really interesting. It's not a 1 or 2 year solution, but it's not a 50-year solution. It's like 5, 10 years away where we can get more local food production. And that's why, to your point about local supply, somewhere like Singapore, this is why it's so important. I spend my time at the University of Cambridge and elsewhere talking to scientists to understand the interrelated impacts of climate, for example, on the area. And they're very nervous because they can't predict it. It could be not too bad, right? Or it could be really terrible, right? And that's the point, is that because the system is at a very fundamental level, the impacts are very hard to understand. So, to get to the point, it's not hard to imagine a Ukraine-type situation where a certain country or countries start to use food supply, even just shutting down their own food export to protect themselves, start to trigger through the system, right? And we cannot rely upon this sort of free market neoliberal philosophy. We can for most things, don't get me wrong. I'm very much an advocate for markets as a way of solving problems, allocating capital, all the things that we know markets do really well. But when you have something so profound as food, and you have a fundamental risk to the food supply, like climate in particular, then we need to put a lot of energy, a lot of effort, right, into fixing it and finding new solutions to it. Having said that, this is a monumentally large industry, as per your company, right, with enormous opportunity. So if we get it right, the value of food, I think food is too cheap. That's very easy for a rich Westerner to say, right? But fundamentally, we're not paying, it's cheap because we're not paying the price, right? We're not paying for the costs in terms of deforestation, in terms of so-and-so. So we have to balance the need for food supply and the affordability of food, but also the resilience of supply becomes a super important issue to me.
Right. You mentioned, Prasit, you mentioned about the pandemic just now. So I'm just really curious about what's your expectations on when can we resume? Everything could resume before 2019. I mean, when will they end? And if possible.
It will resume someday, but it would not be the same. Since the global trade would be more difficult, and due to maybe the climate change, due to the thing happen, due to Ukraine case, I think thing is more uncertain. It's uncertain from geopolitical right now, and uncertain from the climate change, uncertain from maybe the disease. So I think the way that each country and each company doing the thing in the future, it may not be minimize of the cost and maximize of profit. The thinking of everyone maybe should think about how can we optimize the thing that we do. You could not, fully protect from any pandemics in the future. The student in UK and the student in other, maybe some of things is out of our control in general, for us. So what we have to do, as a country, as a company, how can we see the new technology, see the new way of providing the food? Cell-based, actually, we also have been talking with actually more than 30 companies on the cell-based. We also investigating on whether cell-based will be a potential solution or not. But what will happen to people in general is that the cost of the food will be changed. It cannot be the lowest cost anymore. It will be optimization of the cost for every country so that the country have enough food to provide to their people. And one potential thing, since we got the new startup thinking in the world right now, we got a lot of, AI development. The technology may be a potential part of the answer to help us to increase the efficiency, the capacity, to, use the same asset or the same land, but can do more things. And hopefully, I hope, Paul, that, due to the technology itself also, we can produce things more environmental friendly to the world as well.
Yeah, you point to the technology. I know, John, your company has been conducting some of the cutting edge technologies. What do you think a size as a company like yours connect with the world? What kind of crisis? What kind of crisis that your company is trying to tackle?
If you think of the meat category, it's been one of the most successful categories of the 20th century for any product. Like you've had nearly 2.5% growth over the last 60 years. Like we've gone from 100 million tons a year in 1960 to 500 million tons today. And again, on the idea of large numbers, that represents about 70 billion animals for livestock and 1 to 2.5 trillion fish, just to feed demand today. And that's anticipated to go up to, or increase by about 60% by 2050. So when you start to look at those numbers and what's needed, one approach obviously is just scale out what you have today. And we're already using about 39% of the world's habitable land for livestock, either grazing or feed production. We're sending 70% of all antibiotics created globally to the livestock industry. And we're generating about 15% of global greenhouse gases. So it's not sustainable just to scale it directly. And to Prasit's point, cell-based may or may not be the answer. We're all trying to figure out whether or not we can get the cost right. But I think in terms of figuring out what the price has to be, I know there's a lot of detractors in the space, and they're always like, well, how do you know, if you can't get to price parity today, does it really make sense? And the example I always give is, well, yeah, the first time someone went out in a boat and caught 10 fish, if you said, well, that doesn't make sense, you need to catch 2.5 trillion to feed the world, well, you still got to catch your first 10. So we're figuring out what the problems are. In terms of how it grows, if we're able to get to the appropriate unit economics and scale, and we see significant improvements over the last few years, and we're all forecasting ways to kind of get to that price parity. We think a really hyper-local regional model can emerge, ultimately where you're serving neighborhoods rather than massive centralized facilities, and you're knocking out all of the distribution in terms of the greenhouse gases that are caused by having trucks and trains and boats shipping things all around. So in terms of how we can impact things, cell-based right now is a rich world problem. We're nowhere close to a price that would make sense for China, India, or even the likes of Singapore, to be honest. Like even really rich countries, the prices are subsidized. But we all foresee an opportunity over the next 10 years to get to that price parity. But again, exactly as Prasit said, it's up in the air, and it's incredible companies like theirs. Like we have Maple Leaf Foods as one of our key investors. The large protein companies are looking at this as an option. The key is just ensuring that we're all going to end up competing on the same transparent regulatory and market front over time, because the market's going to dictate what consumers really want, what they really need, and then we'll dictate the proper advances in the technologies, not just in our case, but also in the traditional livestock model.
Can I just pick up a point that John made, because I think it's a really important one to get our head around really clearly, and that is that it's not possible to expand the current food system to meet the demand that we assume, right? And that's a really important idea, because it's not like we would do this if we could. We don't have to change because it'd be nice to have a cleaner air or it'd be nice to save more forest. We have to change because we have to change. Now, the change can come in a number of ways. It might come through technology. It might come through changes in practices. It might come from changing diets. We don't know how it will change, and that's the market challenge, is to work out how it will change, but the current system will change. And the reason I emphasise that's my research at the University of Cambridge is in this area of disruptive economic change, right? And there's a very consistent pattern through history, and this applies to a petri dish of bacteria to a global market, is a system will protect itself against change, right? It's a sort of universal scientific theory that applies to human systems as well. And so we see a system protecting itself to delay change, to avoid change, to resist change, and then a system tips into a new state, right? So just to pick an example of the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry has resisted change on climate change and reducing CO2 for decades, when the issue's been around for 40 years, right? But now we've suddenly hit a tipping point where the technologies, I don't mean like overnight tomorrow, but within 5 or 10 years, we'll see dramatic change in energy really accelerating because the system has tipped. And that's the same thing is going to happen in the food industry, is my argument, is that change is inevitable and the current industry will adapt and change and invest here and there, but fundamentally we won't see a lot of change for quite a long time, as in, I think, 5 years, 10 years, and then there'll be a crisis, right? And then the market will do what markets do really, really well, which is to suddenly change gears, right? And that's why markets work, because disruptive change destroys, Schumpeter, the Austrian economist from the 20s, talked about the process of creative destruction, right? The reason markets are so effective is because they destroy the old and create the new. So I don't worry too much about the world in this regard, right? Because I think the world will sort it out, the market will sort it out. But if you're running a company in this area, then you don't want to be the victim of the change, right? You want to be at the forefront of the change, and that's the market investor business challenge to me.
Right. So let's talk about some of the technology specifically. So, Prasit, your company has mentioned about sustainable kitchen. Tell us about that. How is it running?
In our case, maybe we are quite lucky at the beginning that the owner himself have super seriously, strongly believe in using the technology. Of course, at 50 years ago, he may not think about cell-based at that time, but we have strong belief that the technology is the answers for having the food sufficiency at the reasonable good price. The model that he always talking about is that, maybe certain period of time, long time ago, one person can raise the chicken at the maximum of 100 chicken maybe. It's really hard to, for one person to look after 100 chicken. But now, due to the whole engineering design thinking, the smart housing, the automation of feeding water, feeding feed, the whole environment controlling by the mobile phone now, I think one person can let the chicken more than 10,000 chicken per one person. It would mean that the efficiency have been increasing by 500 times. So in our operation, it's always the saying in our operation that, we have 3 high, 1 low things. And one of the 3 high is that high investment in the technologies. It's always our strategic direction all the way. So even then there's a new trend of the future food like plant-based, like cell-based in his case. We always look at what happened. Of course, we don't want to be the victim of the chain of the consumer consumption behavior. So we look a little bit at everything. But we have a strong belief, But technology itself is not just the equipment itself. It can be the bio technology as well. We're talking about the nutrition food. How can we produce the things to our consumer with a better quality? Like we just certainly change certain part of our feed formulation. We put probiotic. We put so many vitamins into the feed, so that we want to make sure that our product, which means pork, chicken or shrimp, are better quality for our customer. But during the process of we producing them, they have to be animal welfare practice, healthier for them also. So we look at every aspect, and we believe that maybe technology and the new thing can help producing things a lot better and cheaper. Even we have to optimize the supply chain and some other thing, that's why we have strong belief on technology.
Right, Preston mentioned about the healthy of the food. So John, a lot of your startup is using a lot of the lab-grown methods. And what's your take on the food security and safety of the food that you provided?
Sure. it's a great time, I guess, to say the FDA approved the first cell-based meat yesterday, saying it was safe to consume. And Singapore has had lab-grown meat on sale since the end of 2020. I think this is actually a great question, and for a bit of a different reason. So I know right now, obviously, when people think of alternative proteins, everyone thinks of like plant-based products, and you think of like, oh, I'm supplementing what was once a bad item, which is meat, which it's not a bad thing, with like this really great thing. The part that people are kind of forgetting, and the research is starting to come out, is that the human body doesn't absorb protein the same from all sources. So there was a study recently it was a group of women, and it was the incidence rate at which they all broke their hip. And they actually found that women who were vegan and vegetarian actually broke their hip at a much higher incidence rate than women who consume protein from animal-based sources. So I think one of the dangerous things of using words like plant-based is that it almost greenwashes and kind of gives a false cloak of safety and optimization over time, when humans have consumed animals for millions of years. Like, I'm an unapologetic meat eater. I love meat. So we're actually focused on creating cell-based meat for meat eaters. And that's the other big part of the problem with plant-based products. You're really focused on such a small sliver that you have, there's a theory in economics called the diffusion of innovation, where that early market doesn't actually match what the other 85% of the market wants. So like, we're building products for the 85% of the market, not the small sliver. So for our product specifically though with nutrition, one of the big differences, so the cell-based world, I don't know who knows what about it, and I'm happy to chat about it later on. Two different types of products are emerging. Everything's called cultivated meat, but they're two wildly different things. On the one side, you have companies who are really focused on the cells. They can't get costs down, so they use a very, very small proportion of cells, mix it with a ton of plant proteins, and say, here's a burger, here's a sausage, here's something processed. We're a fundamentally different approach. We're recreating the functional muscle tissue from the animal and actually doing the muscle to meat transition that occurs post-mortem, which is when the cells actually release a ton of enzymes that interact with the cell's natural scaffolding called ECM, and that's where all of the nutrition comes from. So we're trying to focus on recreating a product that is structurally and biochemically and nutritionally identical to conventional meat. We're not trying to create things that are meat-like. So, but to the point though, it's just, yeah, words matter and descriptions matter, and not everything is the same.
Mm-hmm. And Paul, what about the agricultural perspective? How has your research at the University of Cambridge addressed on that?
Right, so a really big issue for us is to think about the fact that nature, has a value to us, as well as an intrinsic value to itself, and therefore protecting nature and using land for nature is actually very important. Right, and that's also John's point about land, and your points there about technology, right, is that we have to find ways of protecting, using the land to the highest value we can, right, and value, we don't currently do that. Right, where you're going to use land for the biggest short-term financial value without taking account of all the rest of the values it creates. So in the future, we might say, well, the best use of land is to grow the inputs to cultivated meat. Or we might say the best use of land is to actually make nature, to give land to nature to absorb carbon and to create homes for biodiversity. We might say, no, the highest use of land is this or that or that. And so that's a really important issue to me, because there's so many people have a livelihood from the land, right? So we have to think about the transition in this area to incorporate the fact that billions of people, right, are living on land and farming. So if we can't just invent a new technology that takes away the market and leaves them without food or money to buy the food, right? So we have to really think through the systems approach. And that's why agriculture is so important, but it means that agriculture has to change in very profound ways as the way we do it today. And another thing that we discussed a little bit earlier was, let's focus on the problem. Like, the whole plant-based vegan meat sort of simplicity is wrong. Scientifically it's wrong, right? Because if you're having soy, then it's plant-based, but if it's deforesting rainforests in Brazil, that's not okay. Right, so likewise with meat versus plant versus vegan, we have to think through nutritionally where is the value for us, and that's part of the process, I think, as well.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I just want to pick up one from what you said, Paul. about the using of land and the people who use the land for their living. The one thing that I believe is that, if you want to make it sustainable in the case of doing the agricultural, you have to look at the whole value chain. And you have to see how you can distribute the value on your product into all the value chain you have. You have to see if you work with the farmer, how can you help making the farmer produce the product more efficient so that their living standard also can be at a good standard. I think this is the critical part of creating the whole environment together, not just one survive and one dying. Yeah, that's what I just want to add on that part.
Right, I want to move on to some of the responsibility that business have to take over here. So I want to start from you, John. So what do you think of the enterprise like yours? What are some of the social responsibilities or business responsibilities you have taken?
That we have taken, that we plan to take, is probably two different questions.
Well, maybe you can talk about both.
We're early, so it's probably more plan. To what Prasit just said, I don't think there's a binary choice of how to move forward. I don't think it's cell-based or something else. I think it's going to be everything optimizing over time, and then some proportion of the market will kind of fracture. One of the challenges that I think will start to happen, at least with certain food systems in different countries, is that food companies are incredibly high fixed cost businesses. So the moment you start eating away at any kind of market share, unit economics break, things have to be reconsidered. And I think that's exactly where the technology is going to come in on efficiency, just for survival. But in terms of how we plan on moving forward, I think the big thing for cultivated meat is that we actually have to take honest assessments of the life cycle analyses of what we're doing from origination of all of the inputs through to delivery of a product to someone's plate, and properly account for what the carbon usage or the carbon emissions are, what the water usage is, what the land usage is. Because right now, we have an incredible benefit that nobody has to live up to any of the claims. So like you hear the entire industry making the same ridiculous claims of like 90% less this, 90% less that. Maybe. No one has a fully functional plant. No one's, I heard a funny thing from Maple Leaf Foods at one point. So there's a company in California called Upside Foods that has a plant. And they're able to produce, I don't remember what the quantity was. And the Maple Leaf Foods team was like, that's great. That's not even one line in one of our factories for a year. And we have multiple lines. So we're nowhere close to getting to the scale anyone would need to provide food at any kind of reasonable volume. But I think that will be the big responsibility is as we get there, not just kind of doubling down because we have to and we've taken investor money and whatever it is, but it's what is the true accounting cost from a climate side as well as a financial side of our products as we go to market.
Interesting. President, I want to ask you about the same question as well. So how do you see a balance between, any kind of environmental friendly approach and the cost behind it?
I think in our case, it's a philosophy of the company. We doing business in the long run. We are not going to run the business for like venture cap for 5 years and then they move on to other things, So with that long-term thinking, that's why we thought about if we want to do anything, you have to look at the whole value chain from the beginnings. I think, from the farmer all the way to the consumer. How can we make them all together survive with a good, reasonable living standard? It's a bit funny that when we maybe when we look at the farmer, we have to see at current standard level right now, what should be their revenues at the first target, because we cannot do anything by ourselves. You have to work with the whole supply chain. So everyone, but we have to starting with the beginning of the farmer. Whether at this standard of living, we pay them this much. Can we help them create more performance? Can be more efficient. That would be the thing that we do at the beginning. So if we talk about sustainability, I just would like to get back a bit, that at the beginning we talk, in our case, it's a meat business. So we start thinking about how can we do the animal welfare practice the best. How can we have a good process at the beginning? That was the beginning of the thinking long time ago, I think 20, 30 years ago. And during, when you talk about the animal welfare practice, then you start thinking about food safety. do starting about the environment is always in our supply chain way of practice. And up to today, like we are part of the DJSI, I think 8 years in the row already. We are the member of UN SDG. In our case, we apply 17 practice goal. We cannot do 165 requirements that they have, but we do a lot of things and case. That's what we always have I think long-term thinking. If you think really long-term, you have to think what in the long-term, long run that you have to absorb. Environment issue, the pandemic, the carbon, the climate change. I think we have to look at it, for our long-term development also.
Paul, you have been working with so many investors. So what are the overall people's awareness on this kind of issue?
Yeah, I think the awareness that it's coming is very high. The awareness that as to how close it is very low. And that's my point about when systems tip, they tip suddenly. And so I think people are often surprised when they hear what's actually happening in the market today and how advanced some companies are. So I think, a company I know very well, DSM, Dutch company, can now produce fish oil to go as an input into animal feed, right, from algae, right? So they don't need to catch wild caught fish, whereas 25% of wild caught fish today is used as an input to aquaculture, right? Unnecessarily, because the fish oil, the most valuable part of that, can be replaced. So that's a big production in place now. And there are many, many people doing things at scale like that. Yes, it's small relative to the global food market, but once markets tip, they tip really quickly. So I think that's one thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that people are beginning to wake up to how strong the young generation is on these issues. And I say that for two aspects. One is as a customer, right? The reason that plant-based vegan food is taking off so strongly is because they're mainly young people who are saying, I don't want to kill animals, hurt animals, be part of the climate change problem. I want a solution. Yes, there might not be a rational analysis of the nutritional quality, but it's still in the market. Right, so that's a youth kind of idea that's coming through very strongly and will get stronger. But I think the more important thing is that they're also the passionate entrepreneurs. Right, so here in Thailand, I keep on coming across young entrepreneurs and all they talk about is sustainability, climate change, equality, gender rights. Like their businesses are going to be focused on solving these problems. And that's exciting, but it's also a big threat to large old companies who aren't ready for what's coming if they're not ready for it. And that's, I think, a really important market issue. So I think speed of change is really a big question. And I think recognising that that has got many drivers that are accelerating it. So young people are accelerating it. Climate change getting worse is accelerating it. Expectations of investors is definitely like the pushing from banks and so on to have solutions in this area is also, there's all these accelerants, if you like, of the change. And you don't see much in the market until it flips over. And that's where I think we're kind of on the edge of that in the coming few years, not decades, but coming few years, I think is where we are today.
Okay, I think just one open question. What will be on our tomorrow's dinner table? Not necessarily tomorrow, but future's dinner table. Will it be different from a decade ago? Will it be different from a century ago? Whoever can start first.
So one of the misnomers I think everybody says right now about anything food tech is like, oh, this is a revolution. I think that's completely wrong. I think we're transforming the food system, but in order to properly do it, companies need to stop, companies like mine need to stop assuming a market is there and build a category. And I think people aren't looking at it from that perspective because everything consumers want and demand is something that some incredible marketing and team kind of brought forward and made them want. Like that's the reality. There's very few things we want innately. In terms of what we're gonna eat, I mean, we've had years to move to salad and go to all these plant-based things and get rid of meat and all that. It's not something we're gonna do. Even the data is very strong. Like there's a strong correlation between countries increasing GDP per capita and the amount of animal products each individual consumes. So as a country gets richer, people buy more animal products. I don't think the content on the plate is going to change. I think there's going to be some part of the market that's displaced by the production method. And I think, obviously I'm bullish on cell-based meat, but I think cell-based meat can start to enter that conversation, but it'll never entirely eliminate any of the legacy companies. I think things are just going to change in terms of what the offerings are. Like my guess is going to be, once we get to price parity, the legacy companies are probably going to start offering even more premium products. That's probably my guess.
Prasit.
So what I think is that, just what Paul said, the new generation have a totally, supporting on the sustainability. They are worried so much about the climate change. I think they are more maybe potentially aware more than us, because we are a bit in a different generation and the knowledge that we receive. And for this event in Thailand, the APEC CEO Summit here, I think the theme that we have is also on the BCG. Quite lucky for Thailand in general that Thailand be aware a lot on the sustainability. That's why the whole topic is on the on the BCG that I mentioned. So what we have to do is that we have to think carefully, on how can we going to implement on this. The food in the future, no one can know, what will be the new portion of food. Is it cell-based, how much, plant-based, how much, or the existing meat-based, it will be how much. For our company, we have to be investigate for all of that. We are, as I mentioned, we talk with 30 startup company on cell-based. We already start implement the plant-based, but it's too small, both of them. And of course, we have to make our own existing meat business sustainable as much as possible. The commitment that we have, and we already announced that we are seriously look at the SDG number 13 on the net zero. And we are planning our company that, in year 2030, the greenhouse emission should be 42. And we also planning on, year 2015, can we be net zero? We are seriously look at our own operation. We see how we procure the soybean and how we procure the corn. In year 2020, last 2 years, we actually bought a lot each year. We bought maybe 2 million tons of corn, and we be 100% making sure that the area that we buy the corn from is not deforestation area. That's what 100% sure. We check every area that we have. We also look seriously on how we use the electricity. We actually use 11 million megajoule a year. But now 27% of the energy that we use to produce the food is come from the renewable energies. This year we will announce, we already finished the whole project, and we announce next year that we will be a coal-free company. No more coal in our operations. We use biomass, we use biogas. We will try to invest as much as possible in any area, on the roof, on the ground, on the solar roof. Now that's why we can reach up to today 27% of the energy. We use a lot of water also. We use a lot of natural, but we also use it carefully. So now 40% of the water that we use is from reusable water. And we, of course, we also grow the tree to help, getting the water back into the world. I think that was the commitment. And I believe that the generation, the customer will require every company to be more sustainable. That's what I think the future will look like.
Paul, same question.
Yeah, look, I really thank you for that very good example of what I think is the most significant issue in the next few years. And that is the existing food industry lowering its emissions, right, of everything. Consumption of water, consumption of energy, renewable resources, and so on. So I think that's going to be a big change because the customer is going to demand it more and more, and policy will reinforce that. The only thing I would add is that I think the new issue coming very strongly now is methane. So I think that people are going to become very focused on methane for a very simple, without going into a long scientific explanation. But if you want to slow warming down in the short term, because it's a climate emergency, you have to cut methane. Doesn't matter how much CO2 you cut, right, in the short term, because the impact of that is longer term. So you have to reduce methane. Therefore, the effort, the focus of the customer and policymakers, I think, is going to become very sharply on methane, and there are many things the existing industry can do to reduce its methane before these new technologies come along. So I'm very pleased to hear that list.
Thank you very much. So that would do it for this session. Shall we give a last round of applause to our distinguished guests, Mr. Paul Gilding, Mr. Prasit Boondoungprasert, and Mr. John Cappuccitti. Thank you so much. Keep safe. Have a good day.